Hey, Travis here at Books, Builds, and More. Today I'll be doing a review of Stephen King's novel, From a Buick 8. So this is a book that tends to get a lot of negative attention, and I do agree with that to a point. However, I didn't think it was that bad of a read. It's definitely not rock bottom because I just recently read his collection Skeleton Crew, and I could definitely name some stories in that one that were far more lesser than this book. And even a couple of novellas from past collections like Four Past Midnight, If It Bleeds, and some other things. So yeah, I don't think it's bottom of the barrel, but it's still not one of the greatest novels that he's ever written. And speaking of Skeleton Crew, this is not obviously the first time that Stephen King has written a story about some kind of vehicle from hell. I mean, Christine, hello. I have seen the movie. I haven't read the book, even though I do have the book. I just haven't read it yet. But also in Skeleton Crew, there was a short story called Uncle Otto's Truck, which I really did not care about that much. It was just kind of a goofy story. It just kind of ended on a very very goofy way, and that's the best I can put it. But I don't think the story focused mostly about this car, this kind of supernatural, otherworldly thing that is just sort of being kept secret by this group of police officers that have kind of formed together, and they kind of secretly guard it because they don't know what it is. Although they watch certain things that it does, and they're just kind of very cautious, understandably, about that. So they have this kind of close-knit family group, in a way, if you want to call it that. And, they're just the Troop D is what they call themselves. And that's pretty much the basic premise of the story. However, I don't feel like this story was so much about the car as much as it was a sort of moral message that was taking place throughout the entirety of the book, or majority of the book, really, is based on the concept of curiosity and whether or not it's ever fully satisfied, and just kind of our motivations for kind of, satisfying our curiosity. So I kind of liked the message more than I did the actual premise, because to be honest with you, uh, the premise in this book just kind of it felt very anticlimactic, even for a Stephen King book. It just didn't. I don't know. It just felt like it didn't really go anywhere. I mean, at least in terms of this 1954 Buick Roadmaster, which was the model of this car in the book, I felt like a lot of things that pertain to it were left inconclusive, like it was wasted potential. I mean, for example, the car has no origins, which is disturbing alone, and I'm okay with that because sometimes that just adds to the fright factor, is not knowing something's origins. You don't know why it was created, who created it, or what created it. So that alone made it enjoyable in that regard. But after that, like what it actually does, especially ever since we first see it on the page, and then after that, it just, like, what was the point? I felt like, where's the rest of it? Now, as far as the characters go, I did enjoy the characters. They do form this very tight-knit group. However, I felt like it was a little too closely tight-knit. They all kind of, while they all each had their own different personalities, sure, definitely, but a lot of times they felt the same. I said this in my Goodreads review. It felt like he took one character and made several clones of that, but tweaked each of their personalities to kind of make them their own. And it just kind of felt like that. And why they felt so close, why they all thought pretty much the same way, had the same ideas. But I had to keep in mind also that these were trained police officers, at least a majority of them. There were a couple of different characters, like a couple of female dispatchers that were part of this group. One of the cops, his son is actually listening to this whole story, and I'm going to talk about the writing in just a second, and explain more of that. But And there's the barracks janitor, Arky. He was a different. Now he was probably the most standout because he was kind of different. He had a different accent. He was actually a foreigner, I believe, and I don't know. I just felt like the characters were a little too much alike that they were hard to kind of distinguish at times, which is actually unusual for King. Actually, maybe not too unusual. I mean, think of the story of the body where the four kids are close. The Losers Club from It, although those kids were definitely a lot more different than the characters in this book, I thought. Now, while it's not too unusual for King to have characters that you really care about and that do get along very well. It's more fun. I've always found that Stephen King is more fun to read when you have your characters with a whole lot of baggage. They've got secrets, they're criminals, there's just something gray area about them that you could either care for or not care for when they're put in these, horrifying, extraordinary circumstances. And then you wonder, okay, well, how are you going to feel about it if something happens to this character or that one? Or who are you rooting for? Who do you want to save? Who do you want to see bite the bullet? Yeah, it just kind of made me feel like, okay, in a way, forced to care about these characters and care about what happens to them when they go, when in the end, I just really kind of didn't. And that's honestly not coming from a place of not caring about the characters. I did like them, but it just felt like I think topped off with the unimpression of the car and the premise, it just kind of was blah. It just kind of felt like a letdown. It was just very anticlimactic. So having said that, it was just like, okay, like the opening scene from Jaws with the girl, in Jaws, it's going to happen. Uh, it's shocking when it does, even though it's coming. It's still pretty daunting, but I got to give Jaws credit here. That scene was far more effective than anything that happened to anybody in this book. So to mention the writing in this book, I thought it was quite different for Stephen King. You get a lot. This is mostly a flashback story. It switches back and forth to present time and um, the past, of course, which are alternately titled Now and Then, simply. But you get a lot of different perspectives from each of the members in this Troop D regarding this car and everything that's going on. Because one of the cops that had recently passed away, his son is just joining this troop, and they're basically telling him in the present everything that happened leading up to what happened to his dad, basically, and all based on their discovery of this car and what they've done throughout the years to kind of keep it under control, keep it guarded, keep it secret, but how it kind of connects to all these disappearances and whatever these wild things. It's just a very bizarre read, to be honest with you. But one thing I noticed about it, which I think is unusual for King, because King usually has this fluidity about his writing. He tends to, yes, he can change tones very quickly, but they're usually in this fluid manner. This one just completely chops and changes. It goes from like one extreme to the next. Like 1 minute you're listening to all this saccharine, almost in some instances sophomoric dialogue from these characters and this sentimental kind of tone to it, to these really graphic scenes of, like, for example, he gets pretty graphic, even a little more graphic than usual, I think. Of course, I've not read all of Stephen King, so there's probably some worse things out there. And he has written some gross things, but there is like this autopsy scene in this book, sort of, that just really made my stomach churn. I mean, this was like almost bordering on extreme horror stuff here. It was just that graphic. It was just so yeah, I felt like there was a huge difference in the writing style of this. I just felt like it was just very non-King like, this book. Okay, since this is a kind of time shifting story, between now and then, we do get this epilogue called Later, which, obviously. But this is where I'm also going to talk about the ending. Now, this is going to sound a little hypocritical on my part, but I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can. About Stephen King's endings tend to get a lot of flack because a lot of people criticize a lot of the endings in his books, his major novels especially. And to be honest with you, I think this ending was, even though there were some things that were inconclusive in the novel, I don't feel like they were wrapped up. I do feel like this was still a fairly solid ending, for one of his books. I feel like a lot of stuff did get wrapped up, or at least it did feel like an actual conclusion, like, this is all you're going to get. But it goes back to what I said earlier. Now, I have myself in the past have said, I don't mind ambiguous endings, and King is kind of notorious for those, in my opinion. And I like that ambiguity at times because, it gives you the kind of creative freedom in your imagination to kind of let the story go the way you would think or you would want it to go, or feel like how you want to conclude it. Kind of gives you license to do that in a way. But this one, I do feel like it wraps up. However, I don't think it's about wrapping up the actual premise, like anything that's actually happened. I feel like this book, like I said earlier, is more about the message being sent. And that is, satisfying curiosity. Like, there are no assurances ever fully guaranteed all the time in life. So I feel like that like, and that's common sense, that's like goes without saying, common sense stuff. Like, I think everybody knows that premise, but it just felt like it was a reminder of that fact that in reality, no matter what the circumstances, sometimes we're just never going to get the assurance or the closure that we feel that we need or are entitled to or that we want. And I feel like that was the point being made with the ending, not based on just, okay, because there is one thing, like I said, that I felt should have been wrapped up, but looking back on it, it's like, okay, I could really care less. I mean, after everything that's happened, it just doesn't matter, but this, I think, is the point of this. So, yeah, that's my feeling about the ending of the book. I thought it was an okay ending, and it really, not the best, guaranteed not the best, but I think it was the appropriate ending to speak for what it was meant to speak for, if that makes any sense at all. That's what I got out of it. Now, because I have this book on my Dark Tower reading pathway, it was kind of the wild card book when I put this whole order together. And I'm thinking that I may have read this a little too soon, because in terms of its connection to the Dark Tower, in my eyes, I didn't really get it, because I still haven't finished the entire Dark Tower series yet. But, this book falls on a lot of people's Dark Tower, extended reading lists. I think I may have put this one in too early of an order, like I just said, because I didn't really get the connection, unless it's the car itself, because the car does do something that in the book that reminds me of something particularly that happened in the last book that I read, the fourth book of the Dark Tower, The Wizard in Glass. It reminds me of something that happened there. So I'm guessing that's the connection, or mostly the connection is just, the car itself. But when I finish the series, I can always look back, because I'm not going to stress too much about that, because look, I've already read The Stand, Desperation, Everything's Eventual, and Salem's Lot. 5 books that have connections to the Dark Tower that are on just about everybody's Dark Tower extended reading lists. I've read those, some of those years ago, and still remember the stories. It's probably just going to be the same way with this. Once I get through the entire series, I can look back and say, okay, well, this was the connection to this book. So I'm not fretting too much about that. But still, I'm glad I read it when I read it, so I can get that out of the way. So my next one after that, from a Buick 8, is Insomnia. I am getting ready to start this one, and then after that one, I'm going to go on with Rose Matter. So right now, I'm in the middle of this huge gap between books 4 and book 4.5. I am going to go ahead and read Wind Through the Keyhole before book 5 instead of waiting until after the series to read that, which some people tend to do. But I'm going to go ahead and keep it within the time or the publication order or the, excuse me, whatever order, and just do it that way. But right now I've got a lot of books to go through this wide gap before I get straight back into the series. But as it is, that's my plan right now. And that's it, my wrap on From a Buick 8 by Stephen King. If you've read this book, let me know what you think about it. And if you've stuck with me this long, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.